Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we are playing the King's Indian Defense against everything, climbing from 1000 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games, where I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I can for your education and entertainment. For anyone wondering, d6 has to be played against pawn to e4, because if we start with knight to f6 like we would against pawn to d4 or pawn to c4, then we'll be hit with pawn to e5. So we stop that, and then we continue with the normal setup with bishop to g7. In this position, pawn e5 is not really a concern, because if take, take, and king takes, we have good ways to win back the e5 pawn after moves like knight to g4, forking f2, and e5. So just to clear that up. So my opponent goes bishop to g5, and I assume he wants to go for something like queen d2 and a quick bishop to h6, looking to trade off my fianchettoed bishop, which is a valid way to play the position. We will continue by castling, and white may well go queen d2 and castle queenside, but he chooses bishop to c4. Okay. Well, immediately that move should get your alarm bells ringing, and what do I mean by that? Well, this setup is a very common, leads to a very common tactical pattern in lots of different openings. So in this position, we have this very cool move, knight takes e4. And if knight takes e4, we have pawn to d5, forking the pieces. And I think we're actually doing very well there, because I don't think e7 hangs in any of the lines, because we always have rook e8 with pins or skewers with any piece that lands on e4. So we need to consider, if knight takes, can white sacrifice the bishop and then take the knight back? That's a common way for white to deal with it. So knight e4, bishop f7 check, rook f7, knight takes e4. That's a valid way for white to play. Probably something like bishop to f5, hitting the knight c6 is coming. I think we have quite a nice position. I think we have quite a nice position with the bishop pair there. Our light squared bishop should be quite powerful. If knight takes, can white do anything else? Take pawn d5, bishop to d3. He could try that, guarding the knight instead of taking on d5. So after take. Yeah, that's probably the best version. Although we do have bishop to g4, threatening to win the pawn on d4, but maybe we hang the b7 pawn in that line. So, yeah, knight takes e4 is tempting, but I'm not so sure about this bishop to d3 line, which is a very common way to deal with it as white. So your bishop gets on quite an active square, and you don't encourage the black queen out to d5 by taking on d5. So with that in mind, maybe a move like rook e8 makes sense. Playing for e5, because normally the pawn breaks at either c5 or e5. I mean, c5 does make sense, considering what? Considering the bishop isn't on e3, controlling the c5 square, as it often is. We could also even consider a6, b5. Trying to kick the bishop and then kick the knight to win the e4 pawn. That's another possibility. I'm also keenly aware of the potential pin on my queen, so while e5 is very tempting, I'm not 100% sure on it, particularly because after knight takes, there'll be pressure on f7. So I'm not really a fan of that. c6 is interesting, but feels wrong. We could look for b5. Again, a6, b5, we can look for bishop to b7, targeting the e4 pawn as well. That's quite interesting. Knight c6 might be a decent developing move. Knight e7 might be a decent developing move. We have lots of different options in this position. Lots of different options. I think I like the move a6. That's what I'm going to go for. So the point is, I want to go b5, trying to exploit the fact the bishop is on c4, because normally the bishop develops to either e2 or d3, because they're slightly safer squares. If my opponent tries to go queen d2, looking for bishop to h6, then I'm just going to push b5. And h3 looks incorrect already. My opponent is, of course, trying to stop bishop to g4, which I was considering briefly in this position. But I figured that after pawn h3, I don't want to take the knight and bring the white queen out, because this is a decent bishop, and this knight isn't really doing anything that useful. But here we have b5, hitting the bishop. And we could immediately go for pawn to b4, looking to win the e4 pawn. If bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, knight to d5, white counterattacks my bishop, and after I drop back, I mean, I win the dark square bishop. That can't be a terrible thing. Alternatively, bishop to b7 threatens the e4 pawn immediately. And if pawn to d5 trying to block my bishop up, then it opens up this diagonal, and we can look for moves like c5 anyway. We could even look for c5 immediately with the threat of pawn to c4 trapping this bishop. So if c5, take, a4, c4, bishop a2, maybe even b5? Knight d5 is interesting. It's interesting. If c5, take, do we have any other options? I think we should take back there. We do open up this diagonal for the bishop, which is nice. Yeah, take. Bishop e7 isn't going anywhere, necessarily. I'm just not sure I want a queen trade so early. If my opponent goes a4, I've always got pawn to b4. So maybe bishop b7, just threatening the pawn, is an easy move. I think that's what I'm going to go for. So we have the double fianchetto. My opponent goes pawn e5. Okay, so he saves the e4 pawn by simply pushing it, which is valid. I assume knight to e4 should be the move, or maybe take. If we play take, then c5 becomes stronger because white can't take. Knight to e4. e7 could be a problem after a queen trade, though. e7 could hang, so we need to be aware of that. Although I'm actually thinking that taking is probably the best move. Okay, yeah, because my idea was if d takes, I could potentially take the queen and then take on f3, ruining the white pawn structure. So my opponent takes with a knight, but this I felt was a bit of an incorrect way for white to proceed, because d4 is just a target. Also, I have bishop takes g2 if I want it. I mean, I open up my king side a bit, so maybe not. Maybe I shouldn't go for it. We do have pawn to b4 kicking this knight, and it doesn't have any easy squares. Maybe it can go here. I could go knight c6 challenging the knight, also threatening the d4 pawn. And if take, maybe d5 is the idea. So maybe I should just take the pawn. Should I just take the pawn? I think so. I don't think there's a major risk. I mean, f7 is well defended. We have plenty of defensive pieces around my king. And if take, I can always take back with the e-pawn to kick the knight away. That's a nice option too. So here we can take on h3 and win a second pawn. But I don't really fancy opening up the h-file. So I think I'm just going to drop back and take my extra pawn. Because if h4 looking for h5, I can always play h5 myself. And then, unless white can somehow execute f4, f5, there's not going to be any pawn breaks. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. Okay, queen d2 looking for bishop h6 and also castle queenside. Makes sense. Knight c6 here looks pretty good. Pretty good. Now we're up a pawn. Trades are obviously in my favor. We could even look at knight to a5, chasing the bishop. Obviously, d4 is under attack. If take, that looks pretty good to me. Okay, my opponent castles. Now here I'm tempted to take the... Well, you might be tempted to take the knight. But after take, queen d2, rook d2, my knight has to move because it's under attack. And then e7 will hang. So maybe e5 also hangs. But this also, bishop e7 also comes with an attack on my rook, so I'm not convinced. Okay then. So what else can we do? Well, we can go for this knight to a5 idea. That's one option. We could go queen to d6, just bringing our queen out, preparing to bring a rook to the d file. That's also viable. We could look for queenside expansion, but we don't want to hang the b5 pawn, because that's just a loss of a pawn for no reason. b4 is an interesting move. b4 is interesting, because after a move like knight to e2, or, well, let's say knight to a4, looking at the c5 square, we can play knight to e4, forking the bishop and the queen, because we removed the knight from the defense of the e4 square. And then when the queen moves, we take the bishop, and then we have an unopposed dark-squared bishop, which has to be good. So I think b4 is the way to go. I'm not concerned about my opponent taking on f6, because we can take on c3 with tempo on the queen, so that's not going to work. I mean, in theory, black can play take, take, and take, counter-attacking my knight. He could do that, I suppose. If take, though, I think the stronger move might just be e takes f6. So I'm hitting both of white's knights, forcing this, but then I can take with tempo. Something like that. Okay, well, that just looks like white is giving up a knight. I'm attacking that square twice. This knight isn't pinned to my queen. There's an e-pawn in the way. So just knight takes e5. Sorry, d5 even. Okay. I don't see the idea. Bishop h6 isn't that scary. I mean, I'm just going to take this knight. And yes, white can get rid of my dark squared bishop, which normally is a problem, but I'm up an entire piece, so it's not really that big a deal. Okay, let's take with the bishop, because I want to maintain my vision of the a2 square. My opponent can take there, threatening my rook, but I think we can take on a2, threatening checkmate. So let's do it. Queen a2. Checkmate is threatened. White needs to do something about it. He could go queen takes b4, giving his king the d2 square. That would be one way to do it. But if queen takes, I assume I just maybe have bishop h6, although there is bishop g5. But then I do force the bishop off the board. Alternatively, after queen takes, I can go rook to e8, which sets up a nice threat of rook e7, queen e7, bishop h6, because we get rid of the bishop. I think that's going to be my choice. I obviously have rook here as well, but this seems easier to me, because my rook is under attack, so let's just not hang the rook. Bishop g5 stopping bishop h6, good move. But here I thought I had rook to e2. That was my plan. Rook e2. Simply cutting off the d2 square. And it's unclear how white stops queen a1 check. Well, checkmate. Unless he plays queen to a3, offering me a queen trade. Which obviously I will accept, because I'm up an entire piece. Hopefully, this is demonstrating some interesting ideas in the King's Indian, particularly when white castles queenside, which is often, I think, what a lot of people struggle with in the King's Indian, is what do you do when white castles queenside and you don't get your kingside attack? Well, I think this a6 b5 push was quite interesting, and obviously it bore fruit with the move pawn to b4, kicking the knight away. I'll show you what would happen after knight back to e2, which is what I was expecting from my opponent. We don't immediately have to take the queen, in theory, but I don't really see a reason not to, because, again, we're up a whole piece, and my opponent abandons the game, effectively resigned the game. The game is completely over. So, yeah, very, very nice stuff. Let's jump into the analysis and see what the computer has to say. Okay, so 88.9% accuracy for my opponent, 94.6 for us. Let's jump into it. So Some people in the comments will say, Alex, you're not playing a King's Indian, you're playing a Piet's defense because you're playing pawn to d6, not knight to f6. I know, but it is a King's Indian setup, and we play it like a King's Indian. So, knight to f6, obviously attacking the e4 pawn, basically forcing the move knight to c3. Here, the engine likes to move pawn c5, but that transposes into a Sicilian, which I obviously don't want. So, pawn g6 instead. White takes the full center, and we go bishop to g7. Here, bishop g5 is an interesting move. And I thought that after castles, my opponent was going to go queen to d2, looking for bishop to h6. But no, my opponent goes bishop c4. And in this position, I chose to move pawn a6, which isn't the most accurate move, but it's more aggressive. The best move is knight takes e4, which I was calculating very thoroughly. I thought after bishop f7, rook f7, knight e4, we were doing very, very well, and that is correct. After a move like bishop to f5, knight back to c3, and here bishop g4 is quite strong, but queen d7 is also perfectly fine. I rejected this line because after knight e4, pawn d5, I thought if something like bishop takes and queen takes, then I'm doing excellently. The knight retreats, something like, I don't know, queen to c4, stopping white from castling, queen e2, maybe take, and after a move like bishop g4, let's say, if this is taken, rook e8, and we have very, very good pressure, something like take, and bishop takes d4. We're clearly better in this position in the endgame. However, I didn't like the fact that after pawn to d5, my opponent has the option of bishop d3. And after take, here the engine likes pawn c5, because if this is taken, we have queen to c7. We are threatening both pawns, so white has no good way of saving both. And here after knight d7, we are going to win back the pawn on c5 with interest, I guess. Although the engine wants to play some weird line, which I'm just not going to want to play realistically. So I chose pawn to a6 with the idea of pushing pawn to b5, bishop b7, pawn b4, those kinds of things as we saw in the game. Here the best move for white is pawn e5, which is an interesting move because normally this isn't a good idea for white, but here apparently it is. If I take on e5, then after d takes e5, queen d1, rook d1, I play knight g4, hitting the e5 square. And if white takes on e7, rook e8, let's say the bishop retreats to g5. And after something like take, I'm doing absolutely fine here. White basically needs to find this weird move after knight g4 of pawn e6. Because if I go bishop e6, then bishop e6, f e6, and bishop e7, and material is equal. But obviously my pawn structure is a bit strange. That's the engine's idea. But this is, kind of a deep concept. It's, 5 moves ahead. So my opponent played h3, which I can understand is more natural. But the thing is, if I wanted to go bishop g4, I would have done it in this position. I rejected bishop g4 because I was like, well, pawn h3, I'm going to have to take. Because if I retreat, then I've wasted my time. So after take, I was like, well, what have I achieved? I've just brought the white queen out and traded off one of my bishops. Like, why did I do that? That knight wasn't even that strong. So I rejected that idea. And hopefully you can understand why. I was also considering pawn e5 briefly, because normally, after something like take, and knight takes, we have the move knight takes e4, right? Counter-attacking the knight. But the rook is hanging. That's the problem. Let's say the bishop had developed itself to e3, and the game continues as normal, bishop c4, and we go for e5, right? Okay, here there is... What am I missing? Oh, there's knight g5. That's the problem. And also knight e5 comes with tempo on f7. So, again, e5 is often an idea to sacrifice the pawn, but not always, clearly. Anyway, I went a6. Because I was like, okay, b5 is a very strong idea. As we mentioned, e5 is the best move for white, but it's slightly unclear why. My opponent goes h3, stopping bishop g4 and encouraging us to go b5, and we are already equal. After bishop to b3, I chose bishop b7, which is perfectly reasonable. I was considering pawn b4, and if, you know, something like knight to e2, I was like, well, I can probably take on e4, although there is this bishop to d5 move, but I can take here, and after here, knight e6, I sack the exchange, but I get a pawn. I'm not sure if that's worth it. I thought bishop to b7 was the best move, and it is the best move, just putting more pressure on e4. And now b4 is a serious threat. If white does something like castles, for example, here the engine likes knight bd7, but after something like b4, the only move would be knight to d5. If the knight retreats, then I simply win a pawn on e4, and I'm much better. So, my opponent goes e5, which is the best move. And after d takes e5, I thought my opponent was going to play d takes e5. And here, after something like... Here, knight fd7 kind of walks into e6 in my eyes. Here, the best move is c5. And after ef6, bishop e3, I have c4. Which is a very interesting idea, because obviously after take, I win back my piece, and I have these strong bishops, this pawn on c4, which might be a strength, might be a weakness. But my opponent took back with the knight, which thoroughly confused me. Because now this diagonal is simply open, and I grab the pawn on g2, which isn't the best move. Pawn to b4 is the best move, because the knight can't advance, as we saw later in the game. And after the knight moves to a4, now we grab on g2, and after rook g1, bishop to d5. This is the concept that I missed. I was concerned about the knight coming into c5. That's why I rejected the move pawn to b4. But I missed the fact that playing b4 and forcing the knight away means that white doesn't control d5 as well anymore. And bishop d5 offers the bishop trade, which is obviously beneficial for black, because white's light squared bishop is quite strong going after f7. Had I seen that idea, I would have played it. But, okay, I go bishop g2 prematurely. But after rook g1, bishop b7, I'm still much better. Much better. Here, white's best moves apparently knight g6. Trying to use this pin, I guess. And after take, I guess rook g6. Here I have to find rook e8 check. Otherwise, queen g4 could be deadly. And after king f1, play king f8. That's nuts. And then after take, queen g4, I have to run for the hills with king f8. That's an insane line. Again, showcasing why this bishop is actually really strong on the b3 square, targeting f7, because it was obviously pinning the pawn to my king. My opponent goes queen d2, which I think was far more natural. And I go knight c6. Here c5 was another option, looking for pawn to c4, and if takes, then after queen d2, let's say bishop d2, now knight to c6 is pretty good. And I guess I probably just win back the c-pawn after something like b4 and knight to e4. I would assume that's the idea. Is that the idea? Let me see. What happens if black castles? And we go b4. No, that's not the idea. The idea is bishop f3, rook e... No, not bishop e1, rook e1. e6, let's say rook e3. Bishop to b7, let's say white doubles. I don't know why you'd double on the e-file, but let's just say he does. And the engine just wants us to go after the c-pawn with the rook, and I guess knight d7 should easily win back the pawn if we ever want it. So we're just going to be up a pawn with a better endgame. I went knight c6 though. I thought this was easier. And my opponent castles. Here, I thought it'd be a big mistake to play take, because after here, my knight doesn't have any great squares. If I move the knight and something like take, and take on e7, I am better, but barely. I have to find bishop h6 counterattacking, which maybe I find, maybe I don't. The best move in this position would be pawn b4 counterattacking the knight. If the knight moves, then I get knight to e4 with a nice fork, and all is well. So white would have to play take. And after ef6, hitting the bishop, bishop f4, bc3, bc3, and something like f5, we're up a pawn, and the white structure is still pretty bad. Again, a little bit convoluted, bit complicated. I think b4 is the easier move, and it's the best move. Kicking the knight. Here, my opponent, of course, just gave me a knight for free, which we were very happy to take. I was expecting something like knight to a4, looking at the c5 square. And in this position, I was looking at the move knight to e4, forking the queen and the bishop. The engine isn't thrilled by this, although we are better. After queen e3, it wants knight a5. Okay, attacking the bishop, opening up my bishop's defense of the knight. If I take on g5, then after rook g5, knight e5, de5, opening up an attack on my queen, and then, let's say, queen e8. I guess there's e6, which is the issue, and after f5, keeping the diagonal shut. I think I still take black here, personally. I would take black here. I think although white has interesting play on the king's side, I think our dark square bishop is just too powerful, personally. But my opponent went knight e5. And by the way, after here and here... Sorry, not knight e4. After knight to a4... Oh my god, knight a4... The best move would be knight e5, and after de5, queen d2, if rook d2, then knight to e4 is a very strong idea. So maybe I would have seen that, who knows. And it's really bad, because if this rook moves, then I can play take, and bishop h6, pinning the rook to the king, which if you've been watching the King's Indian series so far, you should be aware of this idea of bringing the bishop to h6, and exploiting this diagonal when white castles queenside. We have seen that before. My opponent goes knight d5, we play take, and after knight c6, bishop c6, bishop e7, we counterattack with queen a2. Of course, if you take, you get mated. And I thought this was the easiest way to go. My opponent took on b4, defending the bishop, and if I give a check, and after king d2, I don't really like this position, because why am I giving up an exchange? I mean, I'm completely winning, because I have a very strong bishop pair, and the white king is stranded. You know, here white should be exchanging queens according to the engine, but this is obviously completely winning. Bishop d5, I think, is a very easy way to win this position, because after the king defends, I don't know, rook b8, if rook d3, I have a pin. My bishop can't be touched, and I have pawn c6 defending the bishop very easily. And, you know, this pawn is very weak. All of white's pawns are weak. None of the pawns can defend each other. They're all on their islands of their own. But rook f8, I thought was a far easier option. Counter-attacking the bishop. The bishop goes to g5. Here, bishop f8 is the best move. That's interesting. Stopping queen to a3. But I thought rook e2 was the way to go. Because the only way to stop checkmate is with a trade of queens, which I know is completely winning. And here my opponent effectively resigns by abandoning the game. But after something like take and take, I'm up, I don't know, a piece and a pawn. The white king is still in a lot of trouble. And this is a completely winning endgame. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a lot. If you want to see one of the best King's Indian games we've had in the series so far, check out the video up here. And if you want to see all of the previous episodes of the King's Indian series, check out the playlist down there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.